Good morning and welcome to this installment of Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta's monthly webcast series. My name is Surisha Ganta. I'm an attorney with the partnership, and today we have Ashley Pruitt with us here to speak to us about food donation liability. Before she jumps into the substance of today's topic, I would like to tell you a little bit more about our organization. The mission of Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta is to maximize the impact of pro bono engagement by connecting a network of attorneys with nonprofits in need of free business legal services. If you're interested in more information about our organization or in applying to become a client, please visit our website. Also at the website, you'll find a wealth of resources there, including articles, past webcasts, and in a few days, this webcast will also be posted there for reference. And just a little legal disclaimer, please keep in mind that today's information is just for general purpose. If you have any specific questions about your organization, please reach out to your attorney. And today's webcast is copyright Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta. And now, Ashley, I'll leave it to you. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Surisha. Good morning. Again, my name is Ashley Pruitt. I am an attorney in Atlanta, and I practice in the areas of commercial litigation, employment law, some criminal law, and some immigration. So today, as already been stated, we're going to talk about food donation liability. The federal government passed an act called the Bill Emerson Act. And the Bill Emerson Act is an act that applies to all 50 states that provides legal protection for nonprofits and a host of other people who are seeking to donate food. There are several common misconceptions about food donations. A lot of people feel that if they donate food, they will be either criminally liable or civilly liable, meaning they'll either go to jail or they'll either have to pay some type of fine. The Bill Emerson Act, which is also affectionately called the Good Samaritan Act, rectifies a lot of this. I'm sure you've all heard of different case law or things you've heard in the news about restaurants or grocery stores being held liable for foodborne illnesses or other acts by their food that have caused some type of illness. That is different from this. In the Bill Emerson Act, this is all about donations. Anytime you're distributing food for some type of monetary gain, the Bill Emerson Act does not apply. But in this instance, if we are donating food to people for a good cause, we are protected. All right, so the next slide. What is the Good Samaritan Food Act? Who does it apply to? There's a list of entities here that the Bill Emerson Act covers. And you'll see it covers from corporations to individuals to government entities to partnerships. It covers everyone. So if you fall into this category, which you all will, you are covered by this law. Liability protection. So again, the act applies to people who are donating food, people who are gleaning food. So that means you go to a farm and you are able to pick up crops from that farm that you want to donate. It applies to you as well. It applies to people receiving donations. So if you are a nonprofit organization, someone has donated food to you and then you redistribute that food, it applies to you as well. And that is our last point. It applies to the distribution of donations. I don't know if we said this already, but if you have questions as I'm going forward, please let me know. We can keep this as interactive as we want. So let's talk about criminal or civil liability. How are individuals, nonprofits, corporations protected by the Bill Emerson Act? These are the four main points that you need to consider. 1, is the food apparently wholesome food? You're going to hear me say a lot, wholesome and fit for consumption. Keep that in your head, wholesome, fit for consumption, which basically means that you are donating food that you reasonably believe is fit for consumption, something that if you feel someone else ate, you don't have any reason to believe they would get sick or any type of illness would result as a matter of donating the food. The second point is the food is donated in good faith. Good faith means, again, you're donating the food with a good faith understanding that the food is fit for consumption. The third thing is the food is donated to a nonprofit organization. Basically just mean it doesn't have to be donated to a nonprofit organization, but the food is donated without any expectation of monetary gain. And last but not least, the nonprofit, or it could be a corporation or individual, distributes the food to individuals in need. So again, that is the recipient that is receiving the donated food is not charged any type of fee for the food donation. All right, food recovery. So food recovery, according to the Bill Emerson Act, defines exactly that term donation. Donation is a broad term that could mean a host of different things. The first is field gleaning. So again, that means the collection of crops from farmers. So a lot of times farmers harvest food and many of the food goes to farmers markets, grocery stores, etc. Grocery stores often want fruits and vegetables that look a certain way, so they're more appealing to its customers. However, there are some fruits and vegetables and other crops that may not be aesthetically pleasing to the eye, but are still fit for consumption. So it applies to those vegetables as well, those fruits, vegetables, and crops as well. It can also be perishable produce. So that's the collection of produce from wholesale, retail sources, supermarkets, farmers markets. So if you're donated food from a grocery store, also applies and is considered food recovery. Perishable and prepared foods. I think there's some misconception that prepared foods are not covered by the Good Samaritan Law or the Bill Emerson Act, and that's just not true. The food can be prepared, but again, the key is wholesome and fit for consumption. As long as you reasonably believe that the food that you're donating, even if it's prepared, is fit for the consumption of another person, you're protected. And last but not least, non-perishable and processed food collections apply as well. All right, so Georgia law, and I just use Georgia law as an example. Every state has their own laws that govern food donation liability. And I haven't looked at every single state's laws, but the states that I have looked at seem to kind of coincide with Georgia law. And Georgia law, I highlight the main points that people will not be liable for criminal or civil liability unless injury is caused by some type of intentional act by the donor. The wonderful thing about the federal law is the federal law applies broadly to all 50 states. So even if a state, so let's say you go from Georgia to South Carolina and your nonprofit organization wants to donate food. If you understand the key points in the Bill Emerson Act, you will know that you are protected wherever you go. So states can have their own laws governing food donations. However, the state law cannot in any way make smaller the protections of the federal act. So the only thing a state law can do is broaden the protections by the federal law, but it cannot close or tighten those protections. So if you're protected by the federal government under those regulations, the federal law, you're protected in the states as well. So just keep that in mind, which is the beautiful thing. You can go all over the country, and if you understand this law, you know that you're protected.
We have a question,
Yes.
Ashley. Do you know if the Bill Emerson Act relieves a donator and recipient from complying with transportation rules under the Food Safety Modernization Act?
So does the law comply? Can you repeat that one more time?
Does it relieve a donator and recipient from complying with the Food Safety Modernization Act?
Okay.
Transportation rules.
The food's transportation rules. So the Bill Emerson Act protects donations, and it protects the distributor of those donations. So if there are separate transportation laws that govern the health and safety of the food that's being donated, then yes. We'll talk about further kind of the types of state and federal regulations that are required, that people are required to abide by in an effort to stay protected under the Bill Emerson Act. But mainly, and I hope this answers your question, the Bill Emerson Act protects the food. So if there is some type of state regulation or federal regulation that governs how food should be transported, then the Bill Emerson Act will protect that as long as the food is transported under those federal guidelines.
Thank you.
No problem. Okay, so let's talk about how you can lose your protection under the Bill Emerson Act. There are two big things: gross negligence and intentional misconduct. First, let's talk about gross negligence. So I like to think about gross negligence as willful blindness. You know that potentially there's an issue with the food that you're donating, and instead of taking the extra step to make sure that that food is fit and safe for consumption, you donate it anyway. So I like to use the example of, let's say that you are given some frozen chicken, and the person that gave you the chicken said, "I've had this chicken for a week. It needs to be prepared in the next day or two." You, you put the chicken in the freezer, you don't think about it anymore, and you donate it. That could be considered gross negligence. And gross negligence is very broad and is very much determinative of the specific facts of that case. But it's a willful blindness to making sure that the food is fit and safe for consumption. So don't turn a blind eye to food that you know might need a little bit of extra attention and care to make sure that the recipient of that particular source of food won't get sick. The next way to lose protection under the Bill Emerson Act is intentional misconduct. And I think that's pretty self-explanatory. If you donate food with the intent to harm someone else, then of course you're not going to be protected by any type of laws, federal or state laws. All right, so we've talked a little bit, but let's go into some more details about what types of food are actually protected. And I put here, I like to use this example of the oranges. So food that is protected is food that may not be readily marketable due to appearance, age, freshness, grade, size, or other conditions. So I like to use fruit as an example because I think it's a great example. You can see from the picture of the oranges here, you have the orange in the middle, looks pretty good. It doesn't have any bruising, but the oranges next to it may have some bruising. And as we've discussed before, grocery stores typically don't want to put fruits and vegetables with bruising or any other type of marks on display for their own reasons. Publix wants to be known as the grocery store that has the prettiest produce, and so do the others, of course. But just because they don't put food that has some type of bruising on it, that doesn't mean that the food is not still good. And I think we kind of know that. We've had oranges that may have a big brown spot on them, but once you peel off the peel, it's still just as good. So I say all that to say, if you donate some type of fruits or vegetables that may not be pretty, it doesn't mean they're not fit for consumption. The main thing, again, is wholesome and fit for consumption. All right, so more specifically, factors for donation. Here are the three things that you need to keep in mind, and these different factors apply differently to the types of food involved. So one is the type of food involved. So let's take the banana in the picture, for example. As you know, bananas have a ripen date. Once they get too ripe, most people do not want to eat them, and then after a certain point, they are not fit for consumption. They shouldn't be consumed by anyone. So you have to consider the timeline that the food is fit for consumption. The next thing is the recommended sell-by date and the end user of the donated item. So I like to use the cereal box. Most cereal have an expiration date. They have some type of sell-by date, and they have other dates that the manufacturers like to use in an effort to tell the stores when to display and when to sell the products. All of these dates have some importance, but what you'll find is the dates are not necessarily a determining factor of food health safety. So that's going to take us to our next slide, where we talk about dates. So I'm sure we've all seen a sell-by date, a best if used by date, and a use-by date. And I put on the slide exactly what these dates actually mean. The sell-by date is a display date for the store. So I'm just going to continue using Publix as an example. A manufacturer of cereal or any other product will give the grocery store an item, and they'll say, this is how long we want you to display this particular item. And it could be for a host of reasons. It could be that in 2 weeks they're going to change the box, the color of the box, or they're going to have a new promotion on the box. It could be a host of things. But the sell-by date is not a determining factor of the health and safety of the food. The best if used by date is flavor. So a manufacturer of a product is letting its consumers know, if you use this particular sauce, this salad dressing, we'll use that as an example. If you use the salad dressing by September 30th, it's going to have wonderful flavor. If you use that salad dressing on October 1st and it doesn't taste as well, they can say, hey, we told you to use it by September 30th. That's when you get the peak flavor of that particular product. So again, not a determining factor for health or safety. The use by date is very similar to the best if used by, and again, it deals with peak quality. So again, with the salad dressing, if you use this dressing by September 30th, it is at the peak quality. You're going to get all the flavors and the herbs and all the other ingredients that we put into our product to make it taste as best as possible. After that date, hey, maybe it won't have the same freshness. So, I mean, again, it's not a determining factor for health. So I like to tell people you can't use these dates alone as a way of saying a product is good or bad. So you may have a product that has been donated to you that you would like to distribute to other people that may have a sell-by date of July 30th. That doesn't mean the product is not still good, especially if you know the product is maybe a box of cereal that just because it's a month later, the cereal might still be fresh if it hasn't been opened and has been packaged correctly. Let's look at it on the flip side, though. Let's use our milk carton right here, for example. Milk, as we know, expires, and after a certain time period, the milk is no longer fit for consumption, and consuming that product may cause someone to get sick. So this is kind of when the sell-by dates may help you determine if the food that is being donated to you, that you distribute to other people, is wholesome and fit for consumption. Maybe I do this, maybe I shouldn't, but you might also do this as well. Sometimes I'll have some milk, it's sitting in my refrigerator, it says it expired yesterday, and I'm like, I smell it, look, it's still good, I'm going to continue drinking it. Because the date that is necessarily on the product is not the date that the milk expires. It's the date that the manufacturer or whoever packaged the milk and submitted it to the store is saying, we think that this milk should be used by this date. And that's in an effort to protect them. So you kind of have to use your best judgment and discretion with certain things. Going back to the last slide really quickly, the third factor was the end user of the donated item. This is very important. So let's stick to our milk. We have milk that we received today, August 22nd. The expiration date on the milk carton says August 21st. If you know that you are distributing those milk cartons or those products today, then you may be protected. Now, I would always err on the side of caution for things like milk and other products that you know are perishable. But I say that to say that the end user of the donated item is important. The same with fruit. If you have fruit that has some bruising on it, and sometimes bruising donates that the fruit is starting to ripe, and you know that someone has donated you some bananas, they're starting to ripe, and you know that you want to use these bananas 2 weeks from now, then maybe that particular source of the donation may not be applicable to the distribution of those bananas 2 weeks from today. So you have to keep in mind when the donated food is going to be distributed and the end user of that food. And these dates can help you, but they're not determinative of food health and safety. If that makes sense.
We have a question, Ashley.
Yes.
If a product has an actual expiration date, should that be viewed the same way as these dates? Or is that more hard date?
No, even expiration dates are not as cut and dry. I think to err on the side of caution, I would go by an expiration date. So like we said, milk, you might want to err on the side of caution if it's expired. Maybe you don't want to donate it to other individuals unless you have reason to believe that it's going to be donated or consumed right away. But even expiration dates are not determinative of health and safety always. A lot of times, again, manufacturers, in an effort to protect themselves, understandably so, they allot more time for an expiration date than is necessary. So you may have an item that says it expired again today, and really it has a shelf life of maybe another 2 weeks or so. But that goes back to good faith. If you have good faith to believe that a certain item, despite an expiration date denoting that the item is expired, if you have good reason to believe that the item is still fit for consumption, then you may be protected. I think you kind of straddle the fence a little bit, and it's based on each particular item, and it's based on the circumstances and the type of food involved. But expiration dates alone are not determinative of health and safety. I also want to go back one more time about these dates and how they can hurt you. So don't mean to confuse you all. Let's go back to the product dates. The product dates can also hurt you if you are aware of how a product was packaged or stored. So I like to use applesauce as an example. Applesauce has a very long shelf life if stored correctly. So let's say that you have a cup of applesauce and it says all these dates, the sell by, the best of used by, the used by, and the expiration date is sometime in the far future. Let's say for the purposes of today, it's December 31st is when the applesauce, all these dates apply. But let's say you have reason to believe that the applesauce was stored in a manner that would render the sauce unfit for consumption. So let's say it sat in a hot place to the point where the consistency of the applesauce changed, and maybe the applesauce is no longer as fresh or fit for consumption as it should be. You have to consider all of those things. So just because the date says that you're in the clear, and you can use the dates to kind of guide you, and again, they're not determinative, but just because the date says that they're clear, if the food item was stored in such a way that would render the food unfit for consumption, then you are not protected. So we can use meat. I think meat is a very easy example. You have some meat and you're given the meat. Of course, meat has an expiration date if it's left out too long. You have reason to believe that this meat was left out room temperature. It wasn't frozen, it wasn't refrigerated, and it was left out for 3 or 4 days. Even though the meat, which I doubt it would, even if it potentially still looks like it's fresh, if you know that that meat has not been stored properly, despite what any labeling may say, you want to make sure you're protected and not donate items that you have reason to believe were changed. The wholeness of the item was changed based on how it was stored. So just keep that in mind too. Never let the dates alone be a determining factor for health and safety.
Ashley, we have a question along those lines.
Yes.
Our clients certainly can't open up the products and kind of inspect
Absolutely.
and then put it back on the shelf. So do you have any guidelines for what they should do if something is questionable, if it's applesauce that's been in the sun but isn't expiring for a while? Any recommendations?
Absolutely. I think the beautiful thing about the Bill Emerson Act, which we talked about, is how you lose protection is gross negligence and intentional misconduct. So if you have some applesauce, and of course you're not opening the applesauce and then donating it, you look at the product, the expiration dates are good. You can look at the color of the applesauce. If the applesauce is blue and you know it should be brown, then of course you don't want to donate it. And so that's kind of the situations I'm talking about. You have a cup of applesauce that is turned green, and the expiration date says December 2019. But you can look at this applesauce and say, even though this expiration date is somewhere in the far future, something about this applesauce isn't right based on your knowledge and understanding of applesauce. And what's also important to note that I discuss is good faith. If you have a good faith reason to believe that this applesauce shouldn't be distributed to someone else, don't. So it's kind of one of those things where you really do have to use your common sense. The Bill Emerson Act will protect you from acts where it's not gross negligence or intentional misconduct. And I think distributing some applesauce that's turned green and you know it should be brown could be considered gross negligence because you just turned a willful blind eye to that particular product such that you know it could potentially cause harm to someone else. All right. Let's talk about partial compliance. And this one kind of teeters some lines, but I like to let people know that this is an option. So you may receive donations, and I like to use the canned foods as an example, of items that may not meet all federal and state labeling guidelines. So for instance, dented cans, per many federal and state regulations, or per many state but federal regulations, cans are not supposed to be dented, and they're supposed to have adequate labeling to notify the consumer of what is inside the can. So let's say someone donates to you a can of green beans and the can has several dents in it, but it is your understanding that the dents on the can have no effect on the green beans that are inside, but just that the labeling of the can may not meet federal and state regulations. The Bill Emerson Act does protect items that partially comply. So I listed the 3 different factors of how you can ensure that you are protected, because the thing is that there's so much food waste in our country that I think the Bill Emerson Act tries to rectify that. We shouldn't have to not donate food to someone just because there's a dent in the can or there's a rip in the label, if it doesn't affect the overall health and safety of the food product. So number 1, you want to inform the donee of the non-conforming nature of the item. So if you have some cans of green beans and you know that they're dented, but you would like to donate them to someone else, you need to let them know, make them aware to cover yourself that, hey, these green beans, the cans are dented. Protect yourself, always CYA, protect yourself. The next thing you want to do is make sure that the person who is receiving the donation agrees to recondition the item. This is kind of where it can get a little tricky, but you want to know that, let's say this can of green beans, the label has somehow come off. You know they're green beans, you're donating them in the good faith knowledge that they're green beans, and when you distribute them to another entity that is going to donate them to individuals, you need to have an agreement that you are going to recondition this item such that it meets state and federal regulations. The third thing is, and I like to include this as another effort of covering yourself, you want to make sure that whoever you're donating those items to, that they understand the reconditioning requirements of that particular item. And there are several resources on the internet. I think Feed America talks about different reconditioning guidelines, and several other non-product organizations do so as well. So you just want to make sure there's an understanding that you can still donate items that partially comply in terms of labeling standards. You never want to partially comply with health and safety, but maybe labeling and other conditioning and packaging of the product. But you want to just know that whoever you're donating those items to, they understand the partial compliance and that they will agree to recondition those items. And that's it. So if there are any specific questions about food donation and protection, feel free.
I have one question from a client. If you have a waiver of liability and disclosure about expiration date that's coming up, would that provide sufficient protection for the nonprofit providing the food?
Yes. So waivers, liabilities are great. A waiver in the liability form provide an extra layer of protection. And I do recommend that. If you are donating food and just to protect yourself, if you have any type of reservation about the food that you're donating and the other party will agree to sign any type of waiver, it just provides you an extra layer of protection, extra layer of thickness. So yes, I think that is wonderful advice.
And if our nonprofit has handled the food properly, but it might have been stored inadequately prior to their receipt, would the nonprofit still be protected by the Bill Emerson Act?
So if the food was handled incorrectly prior to the nonprofit's receipt, it goes to knowledge. So if you have food that you have adequately prepared when it came into your possession, but you have knowledge that this food was not adequately stored before, you may not be protected. Again, every circumstance is different, so it really is determinative of the specific facts. But you want to make sure that any type of food you're donating is done in good faith. So to protect yourself, if you have reason to believe that prior to your receiving that the food was handled inadequately, then maybe you would like to reconsider donating that food. However, food that on the flip side, food that you received and you have reason to believe this food was stored properly, that when you received it, that it was handled in an appropriate manner, you donated, it is later determined that maybe the food was not handled properly, you are protected because you donated that food in good faith. So it all comes down to knowledge.
Last question. What about recalled items? Is there an obligation to investigate to see if you know you got a batch of spinach and spinach has been recalled? Are you obligated to go and check your inventory?
I would say this is a bit of a slippery slope, but err on the side of caution. So knowledge is important. If it is determined that you or your organization had information such that you should have been aware of the recall of a specific product, then you may have a responsibility to check to make sure that you're not distributing food that could potentially harm someone else. However, if there is no apparent way or if there is no understanding that you would have information about a product being recalled, you don't necessarily have to go out of your way to research every single item that comes to you to make sure it is not recalled. Again, you have to work under good faith. So if you receive something, there have been billboards posted, it's on the news every other day, or you've received yourself some type of information via an email, a pamphlet, something coming in the mail saying, hey, spinach sold at X store is on a recall. If you are aware of that information and you still donate items from that particular store that could be under that recall, you may be liable because, again, that could be considered gross negligence, which is, again, that willful blindness. So err on the side of caution. If you have heard that certain vegetables, certain produce, certain items have been on a recall list, a certain brand has been on a recall list, do your due diligence. It never hurts to go the extra mile and do some extra due diligence.
Thank you. And a question about who is covered by Bill Emerson Act. If a volunteer is picking up donations on behalf of your organization, would they be covered for if they were delivering it in their private vehicle and maybe stored it in their trunk, which just got hot?
Okay, so let's break this one down. So we have one, the volunteer from your organization is picking up food, and is the volunteer protected?
Are they considered a distributor, and are they covered by Bill Emerson?
Okay, so if a volunteer from your organization is picking up food for distribution, they could be protected. And I say could because, again, it's not so broad. It's very fact intensive. So the Bill Emerson Act does protect, in some instances, like premise liability and liability in terms of distributing food. So let's say you have a volunteer. They are sent to, you have a volunteer, they're sent to a farm. And at the farm, their responsibility is to pick up apples that the farmer is agreeing to donate. If the volunteer gets hurt in the process of picking up those apples, then the Bill Emerson Act protects you as the nonprofit and the volunteer. If a volunteer is picking up food and en route to a distribution center, they get into a car accident, the Bill Emerson Act does not necessarily protect that. What you should do in those particular instances is get waivers and liability forms specifically for volunteers. So I just want to make sure I'm making that distinction clear. If they're doing something in the act of, we're picking up this food physically, I'm picking up apples, I'm climbing up this ladder to grab fruit off the vine of a tree, and the volunteer falls, the Bill Emerson does protect that. Once the products have been adequately received and picked up and put in the car, the Bill Emerson Act may not provide a broad range of coverage for that. In those particular instances, you want to get volunteer waivers and liability forms so that the nonprofit is protected from any negligence or any mishaps from that particular volunteer.
And I think the question is more related to the food items that the volunteer is delivering. So would the volunteer be considered a distributor protected by Bill Emerson in that capacity?
Yes. If the volunteer is working at the direction of the nonprofit, and I think it said something about they put food in the trunk, they can be protected. However, let's say they put food in the trunk, they leave it in the trunk for 2 weeks, then they are no longer protected because, again, that is gross negligence. Because you left this food in the trunk for 2 weeks and then you still decide to distribute it to other people, you are not protected, if that makes sense.
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome.
And one more question related to dented cans. Do you have any guidance? Is there any clarification on when is a dented can too dented for distribution?
Interestingly enough, there's no particular guideline saying one dent is good but 3 dents are bad, or big dents are good and small dents are bad. I think the act was intentionally written very broad so that it could provide a sweeping protection for people, and that different instances can be determined on a case-by-case analysis. So what I would suggest in those situations, if the can is dented such that it has pierced through the can and exposed the food inside, then those are too many dents. But if it's dented in such a way, even if it's dented all over in such a way that there is no apparent reason for you to believe the food inside of the can has been affected, then you're good. You just really have to use your common sense and understanding of that particular food item. So a can full of I don't know, like let's say you have a can full of potatoes, and the can is dented such that the potatoes are now mashed up and all mashed together. That doesn't necessarily mean the food is not fit for consumption. It may just change the dynamic of how the food looks, but it's still fit for consumption. Let's say you have that same can of potatoes and the dent has pierced so much that you can kind of see there's a hole in the can. That's a whole different can of worms. Now the food is not just a different dynamic, but letting air into the can may affect the overall health and safety of the food. So you really just have to judge it on a case-by-case analysis.
Okay, that's all the questions we have. Thank you, Ashley.
Thank you all.